So I'm going to talk about the relationship between social connectedness in adolescence and health-related behaviours at that time in life as well. So the sort of overview is that I'd like to start by saying what's special about adolescence, what do we think of when we talk about connection, a bit of a quick overview of 6 studies that the evidence that I'll show draws on, and then thinking of places that adolescents connect, so family, schools, peers, and the developing romantic and sexual relationships, and then I'll draw it all together, hopefully. So what's special about adolescence? Well, we've all been adolescents, but it's a time of transition from childhood to adulthood. There's a lot of physical changes happening because of puberty. There's a lot of psychological change going on. People are sort of developing their own identity, their purpose in life, hopefully with some hope. Incorporating a sexual identity, they're learning how to think abstractly, they're learning more about strengthening their emotional regulation, hopefully. And also people are developing new levels of independence, new levels of responsibility, and trying to keep their friendships healthy, and maybe learning about romantic relationships. So it's really a really big time of change and flux in somebody's life. So what do we mean by connection? Well, Calvin and Hobbes. Hopefully what that little cartoon is indicating something about friendship. Things are never quite as scary when you've got a best friend. So I think that's saying something about friendship, but also maybe that friends help manage stress in difficult times. Also connection, you can think of people being really worried about their reputation. I mean, I think that goes for all ages. Connections can help get you your basics in life, like food, shelter, sexuality, being safe. But I think probably what we're really thinking about is being in the sense of community, belonging and love in this talk. And when I've talked to young people qualitatively, issues have come out like just valuing being accepted. And the biggest one that's been coming out across all the studies for me is building trust. And I think that's probably a foundational aspect of being able to connect. So the studies that I'm going to draw on are from really central Scotland. So the SHARE, that was a big representative longitudinal study, HR2, which many of you in this room know a lot about, and that took place in the east of Scotland and the west. And then there's some studies from the West, some of which I was involved in and some less so. A lovely, wonderful professor called Patrick West is retired now, and he led most of those. West of Scotland, 1116, PALS, this, and some of my own PhD work was based in Argyll and Clyde. So I don't want to go into masses of details about these, I just want you to know where the data that I'm talking about comes from. A couple of the studies, and I'll try and draw on them, are longitudinal, so that's obviously better for talking about where something's maybe got an indication of, causation more than just association and correlation. And most of them are quite big studies, like one in 135 primary schools. So if you wanted to know more about these, feel free to get in touch, but just to give you a flavour. So the first slide I'm going to show draws us on to looking at family connection and some health outcomes. In this case, I'm talking about young people getting drunk more than once a month. So when I'm going through this talk and looking at different areas of connection, I'm going to try and give a flavour of different health-related behaviours, just to give you a flavour of how, connection doesn't just affect smoking, for instance, or mental health or general malaise. So in this case, I'm looking at getting drunk and binge drinking. It's something that we're famous for, particularly in the west of Scotland. And when you're looking at a graph like this, you can see my mouse. It's if things cross that line, they're not actually significant, but things that don't cross it are significant. And so the further to the right things are, the more powerful they are at influencing. And also, just a bit of a technical thing as well, that everything on that list to the left, everything's adjusted for everything else. It's a multivariate analysis. That's only technical things really I'll say. So really, to interpret this, what it's showing us is that it's very important to spend time as a family. So the less time that families spend together, the more often the young people are involved in binge drinking. Parental monitoring is important, just basic things like knowing where your child is, when they'll be back, who they're with, just that sort of general care. Again, when that's low, there's really an awful lot more binge drinking. Parents' own education is influential as well. And I just put this in just for interest, but that's actually fitting exposure to alcohol in the media. And it's hugely powerful, even when everything else is adjusted for. So I'm just putting that in there because it just shows you that, you know, yes, family is very important, but so are other factors that are shaping young people's lives as well. And we did the same sort of analysis with just general malaise, and we found that, first of all, there was a very strong correlation between people who regularly get drunk more than once a month, and their general malaise. And both shared many of the same predictors, with among the strongest being family time, less family time not being good for well-being, and less monitoring by parents not being good. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is connectedness that might happen within a school setting. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about some analysis we've done about school effects. So just to just to explain, rather than just use technical terms, but when we talk about school effects, we're talking about variations between different schools that exist even after you take account of the pupil composition. So even after you look at things like deprivation and all sorts of, you know, even in this case we often accounted for things like family structure and some of the family variables. So even once you sort of level the playing field for these sort of compositional things, do the effects of school still exist, and what's associated with these effects? So, you know, when I say what might it be associated with, it could be about the school culture and processes, discipline policy, relationships within the school, and of course there's issues like peers. And I'm going to talk about peers, I think, next. So I can say a bit more about peers later as well. So what you're probably wondering what all these ticks are in this. Basically, because I showed you all 6 studies that I'm drawing on earlier, different ones of these studies have done this sort of analysis. And so, say for instance, for relationships here, where there's 3 ticks for smoking, that's because 3 of the studies explored smoking and did the same sort of analysis, so that we can see if we're finding the same things from different independent studies. And all 3 studies found that there were school effects for smoking, drinking and drugs. And 3 of them found that the quality of relationships within a school, so for instance the quality of relationships between the pupils and their teachers, and actually we also looked at pupil-pupil quality of relationships as well, that these relationships were very associated with explaining the school effect on the smoking behaviour of the pupils, and actually particularly for boys. 2 of the studies looked at drinking and again found the real importance of relationships between the drinking behaviour and these relationships in the school. And only 1 of the studies looked at drugs, but again found that relationships within the school were a powerful way of explaining the school effect. And also looking at the kind of ethos of the school, and what we found was protective was when schools had an ethos that was inclusive and had a sort of caring focus, rather than, you know, a school that was really only interested in getting results. You know, you're here just to read and write, and we want you to pass your hires and get A's and make us look like a great successful school. But that wasn't as good for people's health, and what was good for their health was schools that tried to make pupils feel that they belonged, were part of it, that maybe they won't get A in maths, but they can still contribute in some way to the school life. And schools, for instance, had pupil councils, because a lot of the other speakers have talked about sort of, you know, like being involved in advocacy and political type groups. So again, having pupil councils was like a really valuable contribution to this sort of domain. And I think these 2 things probably underpin just attitude to school, because I'm sure if you have a nice experience at school, you're more likely to get up and want to actually go there. So that was important as well. And you can see the other things we explored, it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's a mixture of crosses, no, didn't find that effect, or yes, did. So it's, yeah, it's nice if your school physical environment's nice and so on, but it's not critical to the health of the children. Discipline policy, there's a bit of a mixed bag here, but what we did find helpful was when discipline policies were like restorative, so they'd be focused on, like, rather than being punitive, trying to say, right, we've got a problem here, but how do we move forward in a constructive way so we can still work with each other? Denomination, there was a bit of a link where there was more of an issue in drinking in denominational schools rather than non-denominational. Maybe I don't really fully understand that. And school size, we thought might be important because small schools might find it easier to have a good culture, but actually again there was a mixed finding there, so it's probably less about size and how you handle things. So basically, to just overview that slide, was that in relation to school effects on health related behaviours, all studies showed the importance of teacher-pupil relationships being positive, constructive, being engaged, being involved, being included, and that sort of more or less covers as well the sense of a sort of positive ethos. Now, this is about peers, because we've talked about families, we've talked about schools as like a whole year group, but actually it's more complicated than that because pupils have like little friendship groups, and what this is this is a sort of what we call a social network. So it's like people who nominated each other reciprocally as friends, and it's sort of clustered together into groups. And then what happened was that we gave these maps, or this particular map, to the pupils that generated it and said, what do these groups mean to you? And then they labelled the groups. So, for instance, an example here is what the pupils called computer geeks and long hair rockers. And then another one, for instance, is goths and moshers. I wouldn't have given them these names. This is pupil-generated sexy girls. Anyway, and then you've got your sporty footballer group. So that's generated by the pupils. So we thought we'll give the teachers the same social network and see if the teachers and the pupils would kind of echo each other in recognising them. And the teachers got the same social network, and it took them a heartbeat. It was really obvious to teachers that this made sense to them. So where we had the long hair rockers before, the teachers said they were in bands. Where we had the goths before, the teachers called them studious, quiet, but a bit different. And they didn't talk about sexy girls, they talked about risk-taking and so on. Maybe echoing a bit Mean Girls, a bit the teachers in that one. But I'm going to come back to this point about the complexity, because I think, I'm going to lead on to this a bit in my conclusion, but what I think I'm trying to say here is that, there's been this kind of sense of, can we have a panacea? Can we have an education pack that you can lift off the shelf and apply to school? And I think the reason so many of the outcomes from that sort of way of working doesn't actually make that much difference or that much effect is because schools can be very different. Apart from the fact that pupil compositions are different, they could have a different balance of these sorts of social networks. So the teachers kind of know their pupils in a sense. So I think what I'm going to say at the end, and it's maybe echoing some of the previous speakers' work, that I think it's kind of pointing us towards co-production and sort of self-help in a sense, and encouraging, yes, get experts to work with teachers, but listen to the teachers, talk about what adaptations might be needed to work with their particular groups and subgroups of pupils. So in every other talk, every other bit of slide, I've tried to say, but is this related to health behaviours? So we looked at this with these social networks. So you can, people with, large, complex social networks, smaller, bit peripheral, maybe what we call a tree, a dyad, somebody isolated. And we looked at the rates of smoking, drugs and alcohol. Now alcohol, there was no significant difference. I know. I blame it in the way we use alcohol. It's like you can use it when you're sad, you can use it when you're happy, you know. So okay, so not that very helpful. But when you look at something like smoking and drugs, you get a very similar story. Now, you might tend to think that people are involved in big groups and complex groups. Maybe they would smoke and drink more, maybe they're party animals, but actually that wasn't the case at all. The rates of smoking and drug use were significantly lower in people that belonged to a large social connected network. And they were significantly larger in people that belonged isolatedly or in the dyad or even just the sort of the smaller tree. So actually it's protective to your health to have a sense of belonging and connection to a larger healthy social group. And I was hoping that would connect. Okay, so this was, I've talked about substance uses. This is general health questionnaire, and in particular we're looking at mental well-being, mental health and well-being in the young people. And so basically, the important message to take here is it's good to be brainy, scholastic. It's good to individually be brainy. But it's not so good for your mental health to be in, say, a group of nerds. At least at the time that study was done. Because being a nerd, you're brainy, but it's kind of, nerds at that point were seen as a bit not really cool, mainstream. But actually, I think that's changing, because I think the Big Bang series come in, and now, it's quite cool to be a geek and all the technology and everything. So maybe that's changing, but at the point we did that. So what I'm trying to say is that there's the danger in not taking account of social networks is that sometimes you might do a statistical analysis that didn't look at that, and you would just make a very simplistic thing like, it's healthy for your mental health to be brainy. But actually, if you take account what social network that brainy person's in, that could actually change the story positively or negatively. So again, social connections affect health and behaviour. This is a sadder slide, actually. This was a school had come with concerns about attempted suicide. And we'd already, worked with that school in social networking. And what was indicated, you can see from the reds here, is that all of the people that had tried to commit suicide were very closely socially networked to each other. So again, sometimes, like we were talking to Erica earlier about, teenage pregnancy, and again, work we've done in that showed that there was one school in a deprived area of Dundee, and half of the girls in that school, half, had a pregnancy by the time they'd reached age 20. And we actually went back to the ISD who generated the numbers and said, could you check that? They checked it and it was the case. So obviously, again, these social groupings, they can influence cultures and so on. And apparently, I've been told by my colleague Robert that as well, there's a video on the internet, which you could probably find by Googling, about obesity and social network as well, and it shows how the social networks change over time. So all the thin people start being pregnant. So again, maybe I'm just saying, I think this has got food for thought for how interventions run in the future. So, second last slide in terms of social connection. I'm looking at sort of sexual relationships here, so romantic, and obviously protecting against pregnancy, so i.e. contraceptive use. So what was protective there was talking, which is something you do if you're social connected, planning, which probably helps if you're social connected, not being under pressure, actually being in what people recognise as a relationship for more than a month, and the peer influence, friends' use of condoms, as well as their own intentions, attitude and norms. So again, showing that even being safe in a sexual relationship is influenced by what we call social connections. So in conclusions, I feel myself very strongly that being connected is related to health-related behaviours. and that connection can work through the influence of the family, the school, peers, and even within romantic relationships. I think we've still got an awful lot to learn about complexity. The work that Frank mentioned, which is ongoing and very exciting to be able to explore, is basically telling schools, giving them their own data, working with educational psychologists so it's sustainable, and actually working in partnership and co-production, so getting benefit for that particular school of the teacher's knowledge of their own pupils, and in fact in some schools involving the pupils themselves, which is really exciting. And you know, we help them with the process of the co-production. You know, we talk about, well, what's the evidence base? What might be fruitful and promising things for you to do? And I think, just to link on to the next speaker, I'm excited by the work in the early years and hope that it will pay dividends in the future for adolescents and adults and older people.